faith in our governing institutions and this growing, pervasive urge to completely, check out a society. This intellectual crisis seems to stem directly from the failure of what we once called the American promise.
Right.
The central question we have to grapple with is this. Given the, frankly, overwhelming evidence of systemic erosion and pervasive government deceit, from Cold War surveillance right up to modern AI-driven control, does this anti-establishment opt-out of society represent a rational, justified response? Or is this retreat actually a self-defeating surrender of the human agency we need to rebuild integrity?
A crucial distinction.
I'll be arguing that the rejection of the existing structure, what we might term the dominator culture, is in fact a rational and necessary first step. It's about preserving consciousness and integrity in the face of profound moral decay.
And I come at this from a slightly different angle. While I absolutely see the institutional failures, they're undeniable, horrifying even. I'll argue that this impulse toward retreat or escape or isolation is actually a dangerous abdication of active agency. It's a self-defeating surrender that I think only accelerates the trajectory towards systemic ruin, basically leaving the field clear for corruption to just take over.
Okay, so to understand the rationality of the opt-out, we first have to accept the sheer degree of institutional deception that, I believe, validates this rejection. Let's just look at the bedrock promise that defined post-war America. Back in, say, 1955, the narrative was crystal clear. American capitalism was inherently morally right, promising widely distributed wealth, economic freedom, security, the whole package. The decay of that promise is now, it's manifest. We see a state sliding rapidly toward authoritarianism, marked by the stifling of dissent, the persecution of political opponents. But the most damning historical evidence, for me, surrounds the government's approach to mind-altering substances. It's a real case study in duplicity. On one hand, the state used calculated deceit. They aggressively criminalized psychedelics, not just for safety, but as a political tool to marginalize and discredit anti-war groups and the burgeoning counterculture. They warned youth that taking LSD meant you'd drop out, implying ruin.
Right, the official narrative.
Exactly. But simultaneously, the CIA-funded MK-Ultra projects were actively using these same hallucinogens, specifically targeting vulnerable populations, like heroin addicts they recruited for LSD experiments, precisely to study mind control and manipulation. So the authority was, in effect, manufacturing the crisis it publicly condemned, while secretly exploring its darkest potential. That double game, that profound betrayal, proves the system's warnings were propaganda serving a political agenda. When the very foundation of trust is that rotten, is it any wonder that people, especially young people, feel the only sane response is to reject the entire structure, to reject the dominator culture, that self-perpetuating system of coercive power?
Acknowledge the profound corruption in those historical examples. The state actively betraying public trust like that, it's unforgivable, no question. However, I believe those specific failures point not just to systemic corruption, but fundamentally to a failure of character among administrators. And it's a failure that the retreat impulse, the opt-out idea, only compounds, in my view.
How so?
Well, the systemic failures are real, absolutely. But seeking escape, whether it's physically moving off-grid or seeking escape through illusion, like the search for mind-expanding insight via substances, that seems to me precisely the wrong response. Look, even the anti-drug narrative, however distorted by propaganda it was, recognized a kernel of truth. The danger of LSD wasn't primarily physical addiction, but that the user could become psychologically hooked. And this outcome, this sort of inner surrender and dependency, aligns terrifyingly well with the ultimate goals of psychological control that the very government programs you cited were exploring.
Seeking freedom through altered states often risks falling into what some called a cruel self-delusion, where individuals become, permanently unmoored or caught in destructive cycles. We see the consequences in historical accounts, users inflicting self-harm, spiraling into dependency on uppers and downers. It wasn't always liberation. So instead of fleeing the battle, I argue the solution requires asserting integrity and disciplined character within the arena. Alexander Hamilton warned about this, didn't he? That men seeking to overturn liberty often commence demagogues and end tyrants. The system fails when its administrators and, crucially, its citizens lack integrity. Deciding to drop out entirely? That's surrendering the field to corruption. It's mistaking a hallucination for freedom, instead of engaging in the hard work needed to build freedom.
Okay, if we accept your point about the historical deceit, let's examine how that systemic decay plays out now in our current information landscape, particularly around this concept of truth itself, because the dominator culture, as I see it, is entirely built on manipulated narratives.
Right.
You look at someone like Terence McKenna, the philosopher and ethnobotanist. He argued that language itself often obfuscates reality rather than revealing it, and that mass media, particularly television back then, acted as a kind of electronic heroin, just dulling critical thought. Now, in that context, the explosive growth of decentralized digital communication, what he might have called the global meme pool, becomes a necessary, if chaotic, disruptor. It allows for novelty, for new ideas, to challenge the status quo at an unprecedented speed. My position is that this information chaos actually forces the system either adjust rapidly, integrate this novelty, or it inevitably crashes. And given what we discussed, a generation promised security but delivered surveillance and economic precarity, is there any wonder why some might feel the urge to push the art pedal through the floor, as it were?
To try and break that ossified structure entirely, maybe even through finality or martyrdom. Choosing to opt out can be seen as a move toward creating a new reality when the official one feels like a fundamental lie.
I understand the impulse, the desire to use chaos as a disruptive tool against a system perceived as corrupt, but I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because abandoning the traditional frame, especially in our current technological era, that seems lethal to me. If your mechanism for challenging the status quo is essentially total information breakdown, how do we ever establish the shared foundation of integrity that, ironically, your side also claims to want to preserve?
Well, the foundation is already broken.
But look, we're dealing now with what some are calling AI psychosis, the psychological effect of pervasive, often undetectable digital manipulation. The sheer proliferation of deepfakes, AI-powered malware, our grip on objective reality is under constant assault, not just by state actors anymore, but by criminals, sophisticated non-state groups. I mean, the example of finance workers paying out millions after video calls with deepfake CFOs, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And it's not just the bad guys. Even government agencies sometimes contribute to this disillusion of reality, using videos with incorrect dates or locations to justify contentious policies. When people retreat into their own separate online realities and start talking across each other rather than to each other, reasoned discourse just becomes impossible. You get this intense polarization that just tears society apart.
You can't effectively fight systemic ruin, I don't think, by first dissolving the shared reality you need for any kind of collective action.
That's a powerful point about polarization, certainly. But I'd argue that polarization is a direct result of the structural corruption being fully exposed, not merely a symptom of online communication styles. The corruption isn't just abstract talk. It's backed by actual physical infrastructure with, frankly, total reach. Which brings us back to surveillance. Look at the legacy of Echelon, that huge Cold War electronic intelligence network. It didn't just vanish when the Soviet Union collapsed. No, it evolved. It became a universal industrial-scale surveillance machine, monitoring essentially almost everyone globally through social media data mining, tapping undersea communication cables.
The scale is staggering, yes.
And this total reach of the dominator culture is mirrored domestically, often targeting the most vulnerable. Consider the deployment of compromised Internet of Things devices. Take something like the Halo sensor, placed in public housing units supposedly just for monitoring air quality or vape detection. Okay, fine. But the manufacturer can turn these devices into audio bugs remotely via a simple server-side toggle. This means privacy for low-income citizens becomes a complete fiction. The authority of these devices, or who can compel the manufacturer, potentially have root access to their private conversations. When authorities possess and potentially wield this capability, retreat isn't surrender. It's a desperate, maybe the only rational attempt to preserve some shred of consciousness and dignity in a space the system has rendered utterly toxic.
I share your grave concern about the scope of surveillance, I really do. But the position of total retreat, it seems to me, ignores the fact that human agency, specifically asserting trust and dignity, remains perhaps the most powerful counterforce we have. The path to combating this kind of dehumanizing surveillance state isn't through isolation, I believe, but through active, pragmatic reassertion of human worth within the system, however flawed.
But how? When the system holds all the cards?
We'll look at other areas. We see this principle proven surprisingly effectively sometimes in anti-poverty work. Historically, many traditional aid programs failed, partly because bureaucratic experts dictated terms, effectively stealing agency from the poor, even if unintentionally. Yet modern studies on things like unconditional cash transfers, basically just trusting impoverished people to make their own choices with the money, show fantastic, measurable improvements in financial stability, mental health, you name it. Why? Because it respects human dignity. It grants agency. Analogously, we don't necessarily lack the intelligence data to fight surveillance. Intelligence is supposed to be for decision makers to do something. When the data on that halo sensor reveals a security flaw or a privacy violation, the response isn't just to despair and retreat.
It's to unmask those flaws, to campaign for strong privacy legislation, to build tools that counter it, to refuse to succumb to the despair that breeds retreat. Giving up the battleground entirely, that's exactly what a controlling system would want, isn't it?
But what happens when that system has so thoroughly betrayed its people? When institutions seem to ignore federal judge rulings, maintaining their authority through, semantic games and sheer technological leverage, what action is left for the individual then? That desire you hear sometimes to solve it with finality or martyrdom, to either burn the whole thing down or just abandon it forever, that feels like a valid emotional, maybe even philosophical response to relentless systemic decay.
Valid emotionally, perhaps, but strategically?
Look, for a generation, maybe multiple generations now, promised the pursuit of happiness, but delivered pervasive surveillance and economic insecurity, maybe the only true defiance left is the refusal to compromise one's integrity by continuing to participate in the lie. McKenna's counsel was radical on this. Claim your own vision, claim your intuition, and then act without regret, cleanly without regret. Maybe that's the only form of true freedom left against cultural ossification, a willingness to sacrifice participation for the sake of internal freedom, even if it looks like opting out.
Focusing on, apocalyptic finality or dramatic martyrdom, I think, is a tragic misdirection. It puts the focus on a single heroic act, which distracts from the, frankly, much harder sustained effort required to maintain any kind of functioning, free society. The strength of a free system, if it's to have any strength, relies not on explosive defiance, but on the consistent, disciplined practice of courage, day in and day out in the face of pressure. History shows us, I think, that courage is a lifelong journey of lessons and practice, not just one singular moment of self-sacrifice or escape. Think about military or political leaders who face that existential decision, giving honest, unflinching advice to corrupt power, knowing it could cost them everything, their career, their influence. The imperative, the hard path, is to stand firm and preach truth to power from within the system, however broken it seems. That requires sustained presence, it requires engagement. When you walk away seeking some illusion of finality or purity, you lose the opportunity, maybe the only opportunity, to assert the very integrity that might, just might, help course correct the system from the inside.
Ultimately, the evidence I see demonstrates that the systemic foundation of American life has, crumbled. It feels built upon calculated governmental deceit and now buttressed by total technological surveillance. So to preserve individual consciousness and integrity, the things a dominator culture maybe can't fully co-opt, the rejection of that culture, the opt-outs, feels like a rational, maybe even necessary first step towards reclaiming some kind of freedom. It might be the only guaranteed way left to maintain sovereignty over this self.
And I'd counter that the failure of society is fundamentally a failure of character and sustained agency, not just technology or structure. Retreating into isolation or, worse, delusion is merely surrendering the ground to the forces of control and complexity. It allows corruption to win by default. The path forward, difficult as it is, requires pragmatic, disciplined action, and yes, the humility to engage in dialogue, to challenge corruption with integrity in the shared space we still inhabit, rather than abandoning the struggle entirely for what might just be a momentary illusion of separation.
So, we've explored whether abandoning this seemingly poisoned structure offers the only real hope for meaningful change.
And alternatively, whether bravely attempting to reclaim the authority lost by our institutions through dedicated, persistent human agency provides a viable, if difficult, path forward.
As always, the listener is left to weigh this evidence, consider these perspectives, and decide for themselves where the path to true integrity might lie.